So here's one of the biggest questions of our time. Can a machine ever truly be conscious? As AI gets more and more sophisticated, this isn't science fiction anymore. But to even begin to answer that, we have to tackle an even bigger, older question. What even is consciousness? To figure out if a machine can think, we first have to explore this centuries-old mystery of the ghost in the machine. So let's dive in. We talk about the brain all the time as this incredibly complex biological machine, right? And if our own consciousness comes from a machine made of meat, well, why couldn't we just build an artificial one that does the exact same thing? This, right here, is the fundamental puzzle we're going to unpack. To get started, we actually have to go way back. I'm talking 17th century, to the philosopher who really set the stage for this entire debate, René Descartes. His idea was so powerful, so influential, that it got this amazing nickname, the ghost in the machine. So, Descartes' big idea was to basically split the entire universe into two fundamentally different kinds of stuff. On one side, you've got physical substance, your body, a chair, a planet. Its defining feature is that it takes up space. But then on the other side, you have mental substance, your mind. Its whole essence is thinking. And here's the kicker. It takes up no physical space at all. We're talking two completely separate realities, one physical, one purely mental. So, how in the world did he argue for such a radical split? Well, with a surprisingly simple and elegant argument. He starts with a basic fact. Anything physical can be divided. You can cut a brain in half, right? You can chop off an arm. But he argued, your mind, your consciousness, your sense of self, you can't divide that. You can't have half a thought or a quarter of a feeling. And since a fundamental rule of logic says that for two things to be the same, they have to share all the same properties, well, the conclusion is kind of unavoidable. If one is divisible and the other isn't, they simply cannot be the same thing. But, and this is a huge but, this brilliant idea immediately smacks into a massive problem. A problem that has haunted this theory for centuries. If the mind is a non-physical ghost and the body is a physical machine, how does the ghost actually pull the levers? How does your non-physical decision to raise your hand actually cause your very physical arm to go up? This is what's famously known as the interaction problem. And that very problem brings us forward a few hundred years into the 20th century and to a major takedown of Descartes' idea from a philosopher named Gilbert Ryle. He argued that Descartes wasn't just a little bit wrong. He made a fundamental error in his entire way of thinking about the problem.
Wow, you can really feel the heat in this quote, can't you? Deliberate abusiveness. Ryle wasn't just disagreeing with Descartes. He was saying this whole concept of a ghost in the machine was a deeply confused, misleading idea that we needed to just throw out entirely. So what was this huge mistake? Ryle called it a category mistake. It's what happens when you put something in the wrong conceptual box. It's kind of like asking, what color is the number 7? The question itself is confused because you're trying to apply a property from one category, colors, to something from a completely different category, numbers. Ryle's big accusation is that Descartes did exactly this with the mind. Ryle makes his point with this absolutely brilliant analogy. Imagine you're giving someone a tour of a big university. You show them the libraries, the science labs, the lecture halls, the whole shebang. And at the end of the tour, they turn to you and ask, okay, this is all great, but where is the university? The mistake is obvious, right? The university isn't another building separate from all the other ones. It's the way all those parts are organized and work together. Ryle says Descartes made the exact same mistake. He looked at all the parts of the body, didn't see a thing called the mind, and so he assumed it must be a separate, invisible thing, a classic category mistake. Okay, so if the mind isn't a thing at all, then what is it? Well, Ryle suggested we think of it more like the brittleness of glass. Brittleness isn't some tiny invisible ghost hiding inside the glass making it break. No, it's just a property, a tendency or a disposition for the glass to behave a certain way, to shatter under certain conditions, like being hit. So what if the mind is just like that? Not a ghost in the machine, but a whole complex set of dispositions to behave intelligently, to feel things, to talk, and everything else we do. Ryle's critique really did a number on the whole ghost in the machine idea for a lot of people. It basically paved the way for a much more modern scientific view. And this brings us to a perspective that sees consciousness not as a ghost, but as a product of our biology. Thinkers like the scientist Richard Dawkins really champion this materialist view. The argument is pretty straightforward.
We are physical, material beings. Our best science tells us we're complex survival machines built by our DNA. And in all of that science, there's just no evidence for some separate non-physical soul or mind, what Dawkins calls soul one. From this point of view, everything we call the mind, our thoughts, our feelings, our very sense of self, is ultimately just the product of incredibly complex biological processes happening inside our brain. So, case closed, right? Consciousness is just brain activity. All we have to do is figure out the brain, and we've got it. Well, not so fast. It turns out that even within this purely physical, biological view, there is a profound mystery that remains. A mystery that has become known as the hard problem. This is where the philosopher David Chalmers makes this really crucial distinction. He talks about the easy problems, and let's be clear, they are not easy at all, but they're relatively easy. These are things like mapping out which part of the brain processes vision, or how we store memories. They're basically huge engineering problems for neuroscience, and we're making progress. But then, there's the hard problem. Why does all that electrical and chemical processing feel like anything from the inside? Why is there a subjective first-person experience of seeing the color red or feeling happy? What biological process is responsible for the actual feeling of what it's like to be you? And on that question, science has made almost no progress at all. And this brings us right back to where we started with our AI. We've journeyed from this idea of a spiritual ghost to a biological machine, only to find an even deeper mystery humming away at its core. If we can't even explain why our own biological machine produces this inner, subjective experience, how can we ever hope to build an artificial one that does? And that leaves us with the final, really haunting question. Even if we did build it, how could we ever truly know if there was actually someone home?